I couldn't help but feel that same knot of anxiety in my stomach. Being back in this town brought up memories I'd worked so hard to bury. Memories of Kyle, of the bullying, of feeling small and scared. But this time, things were different. I wasn't the same kid I used to be. I was stronger now, more confident, and I wasn't going to let the past ruin Sarah's big day. The day before the wedding, Sarah invited me over to her family's house to help with the last-minute preparations. I hadn't been there in years, and as I pulled into the driveway, I felt a strange sense of déjà vu. The house looked exactly the same white picket fence, the same flower beds her mom had meticulously cared for, and of course, the same window on the second floor that used to be Kyle's room. I hadn't seen Kyle since I left town. He had stayed here, working with his dad's construction company, while I had gone off to college and built a life for myself. We hadn't spoken in years, and honestly, I had no desire to. But as I knocked on the front door, a part of me wondered what it would be like to see him again. Had he changed? Was he still the same person who had made my life miserable? Sarah answered the door, pulling me into a tight hug. "It's so good to see you," she squealed, practically bouncing with excitement. "You too," I laughed, hugging her back. "I can't believe you're getting married tomorrow. Feels like just yesterday we were planning our lives in your treehouse." Sarah grinned, pulling me inside. "I know. Come on, everyone's in the kitchen. We're going over the final details." As we walked through the house, I couldn't help but glance around, taking in the familiar sights. Everything looked the same, but it felt different, somehow smaller maybe, or just more distant. The sounds of laughter and conversation filled the air, and for a moment I felt a sense of peace. I had made it. I had come back, and I was okay. But that peace shattered the moment I walked into the kitchen and saw him, Kyle. He was standing at the counter, chopping vegetables, his back to me. I froze in the doorway, my heart racing. He hadn't noticed me yet, but just seeing him again after all these years brought back a flood of emotions I wasn't prepared for. I was no longer the scared kid he used to torment, but that didn't mean I wasn't still affected by everything he had done. "Kyle, you remember Jacob, right?" Sarah's voice broke through my thoughts, and Kyle turned around, his eyes landing on me. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the air thick with unspoken tension. Kyle had changed. He looked older, more tired, maybe even a little softer around the edges. But the sight of him still made my stomach twist with nerves. "Yeah," he said, his voice flat. "I remember." I forced a smile, nodding in return. "Hey, Kyle." He didn't respond, just turned back to the counter, resuming his task as if I wasn't even there. Sarah shot me an apologetic look, but I shrugged it off, trying to focus on the task at hand. I wasn't going to let Kyle get to me. Not today. The rest of the day passed in a blur of wedding preparations, with Sarah and her family bustling around, making sure everything was perfect. I tried to keep my distance from Kyle, but it was hard to avoid him completely. Every time I caught a glimpse of him out of the corner of my eye, I felt that familiar knot of anxiety tighten in my chest. As the evening wore on and the guests started to leave, Sarah pulled me aside. "Hey," she said softly, her brow furrowed with concern. "Are you okay?" I forced a smile, nodding. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just a lot of memories, you know?" Sarah sighed, glancing over at Kyle, who was talking to one of the caterers. "I know things were rough between you two back in the day, but he's different now, Jacob. He's grown up." I raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "Really? Because he's barely said 2 words to me all day." Sarah bit her lip, clearly torn. "I know, and I'm sorry. But please, just give him a chance." "For me?" I hesitated, then sighed. "Fine, but only because it's your wedding." Sarah smiled, pulling me into a quick hug. "Thank you. I promise it'll be fine." Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I found myself sitting on the back porch, nursing a beer and staring out at the darkened yard. The night was quiet, the only sound the occasional chirp of crickets in the distance. I was lost in thought when I heard the door creak open behind me. I turned to see Kyle stepping outside, a beer in his hand. He didn't say anything, just nodded in my direction before sitting down on the porch steps a few feet away from me. For a long moment, we sat in silence, the tension between us thick and uncomfortable. I could feel the weight of everything that had gone unsaid over the years pressing down on me, but I didn't know how to break the silence. Finally, Kyle spoke. "I've been wanting to say something," he began, his voice low. About how things were between us." I looked over at him, surprised. He wasn't looking at me, his gaze fixed on the ground, but there was a seriousness in his tone that I hadn't expected. "I know I was a jerk to you," he continued, his fingers nervously tapping the side of his beer bottle. "And I know it's probably too late to apologize, but I'm sorry, Jacob. I really am." His words hung in the air, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. I had spent years hating Kyle for what he had put me through, for the way he had made me feel like I didn't belong. But hearing him actually apologize, made something inside me shift. "I appreciate that," I said quietly, my voice steady. "It wasn't easy growing up with you around, Kyle. But thank you for saying that." Kyle nodded, still not looking at me. "I've changed," he said softly. "I'm not that guy anymore." There was something raw in his voice, something vulnerable, and for the first time, I saw a side of Kyle that I hadn't seen before. Maybe he had changed. Maybe he wasn't the same person who had tormented me all those years ago. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past lift just a little. "We all change," I said, offering him a small smile. "And it's never too late to try to make things right." Kyle glanced over at me, his eyes meeting mine for the first time that night. There was a softness in his gaze that caught me off guard, and for a moment I felt something stirring inside me, something I hadn't expected. Before I could stop myself, I leaned in, closing the distance between us. I kissed him softly, tentatively, unsure of what I was doing or why. For a split second, Kyle froze, his body tense with surprise. But then, to my shock, he kissed me back. For a moment, everything stopped. The world around us faded, and all I could focus on was the fact that I was kissing Kyle, my childhood bully, my best friend's older brother, the guy I had spent years hating. It didn't make sense, but at the same time, it felt like something had clicked into place, like all the tension between us had finally found its release. Kyle kissed me back, his lips soft and unsure at first, as if he was trying to figure out how to navigate this unexpected turn of events. But then the kiss deepened, becoming more confident, more urgent, and suddenly everything felt real to real. I pulled away, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing. "What are we doing?" I whispered, staring at him in disbelief. Kyle didn't answer right away. He just sat there, his breathing heavy, his eyes locked on mine. There was confusion in his gaze, but also something else, something that mirrored the storm of emotions I was feeling. "I don't know," he finally said, his voice barely audible. "But I don't want to stop." I shook my head, trying to make sense of the situation. This was Kyle, the guy who had made my life a living hell growing up. The guy who had thrown slurs at me, who had mocked me in front of everyone. And now here we were, sitting on the back porch of his family's house, kissing like none of that had ever happened. "This is crazy," I muttered, running a hand through my hair. I don't understand what's happening." Kyle leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he stared down at the ground. "I don't understand it either," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "But I meant what I said earlier, Jacob. I've changed. I'm not the same person I was back then." I let out a shaky breath, feeling the weight of his words settle over me. Part of me wanted to believe him, to believe that he had changed, but another part of me was still hurt, still carrying the scars of everything he had put me through. "I spent years hating you," I said quietly, my voice tinged with bitterness. "You were the worst part of my life, Kyle. I don't know how to just forget that." Kyle nodded, his expression serious. "I know. And I don't expect you to forget it. What I did to you, it was awful. I was a coward and I hurt you because I didn't know how to deal with my own feelings." I frowned, confused by his words. "What do you mean, your own feelings?" Kyle let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "I was angry, confused. I grew up in a house where I was told that being different was wrong, that people like you were wrong. And deep down, I hated myself for feeling the way I did. I was terrified of what it would mean if anyone found out." I stared at him, my mind racing. "What are you saying?" Kyle looked up at me, his eyes filled with a vulnerability I had never seen before. "I'm saying that I was scared," he said softly. "Scared of who I was. Scared of how I felt about you." His words hit me like a ton of bricks. I had never once considered that Kyle's bullying might have been rooted in something deeper, something he hadn't known how to deal with. I had always assumed that he hated me because I was different, because I was gay. But now, sitting here in the dark, I realized that maybe, just maybe, there was more to the story than I had ever known. I didn't know how to handle it, Kyle continued, his voice trembling slightly. So I pushed you away. I made you feel like you didn't belong because I was afraid. Afraid of what it would mean if I admitted the truth to myself. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. And what's the truth? Kyle looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. The truth is that I liked you, he said quietly. I didn't want to, but I did. And I didn't know how to deal with that, so I took it out on you. For a long moment, I couldn't say anything. The weight of his confession was overwhelming, and I didn't know how to process it. I had spent years hating Kyle, and now he was sitting here, telling me that his bullying had been a way to hide his own feelings for me. Why didn't you ever say anything? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Kyle let out a shaky breath, running a hand through his hair. I was scared, he admitted. I grew up thinking that liking guys was wrong, that it made me weak. And I didn't want to be weak. So I pushed those feelings down, and I lashed out at you because you were brave enough to be yourself. His words sent a shockwave through me. All these years, I had seen Kyle as the enemy, the person who had made my life a nightmare. But now I was starting to see him in a new light, as someone who had been struggling with his own identity just like I had. I'm not asking you to forgive me, Kyle said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. I know I don't deserve that. But I wanted you to know the truth. I sat there in silence, my mind racing. This wasn't how I had imagined this night going. I had spent so long resenting Kyle, and now he was opening up to me in a way I had never expected. I don't know what to say, I admitted, my voice shaky. Kyle nodded, his expression somber. I didn't expect you to say anything. I needed you to know. We sat there in silence for what felt like hours, the weight of everything hanging heavy between us. I didn't know how to feel. Part of me was still angry, still hurt by everything Kyle had put me through. But another part of me felt something I hadn't expected, understanding, maybe even sympathy. I hated you, I finally said, my voice raw with emotion. I hated you for so long, Kyle. And now you're telling me that you like me? Kyle let out a bitter laugh, nodding. I know it doesn't make sense. It's messed up. But yeah, I did. I still do. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I wasn't sure how to process what he was saying, but I couldn't deny the pull I felt between us. It was confusing, conflicting, but there was no denying that something had shifted. What happens now? I asked, my voice quiet. Kyle looked over at me, his expression unreadable. I don't know, he admitted. But I am willing to figure it out if you are. The days leading up to Sarah's wedding were a blur of emotions. I couldn't stop thinking about that night on the porch, about the kiss, about everything Kyle had said. It felt like my world had been turned upside down, and I didn't know how to make sense of it. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that Kyle wasn't the same person he had been all those years ago. He had grown up, just like I had. He had changed, and maybe, just maybe, we could figure this out together. On the day of the wedding, as Sarah walked down the aisle, I couldn't help but glance over at Kyle. He was standing off to the side, watching his sister with a soft smile on his face. When our eyes met, he gave me a small nod, and I felt a surge of warmth in my chest. Maybe things hadn't started off the way I had wanted. Maybe our past was messy and complicated. But standing there watching Sarah marry the love of her life, I realized that maybe the future didn't have to be defined by the mistakes of the past. After the ceremony, as we stood outside the reception hall, I found myself standing next to Kyle again. He glanced over at me, a nervous smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Hey, he said softly. Hey, I replied, my heart racing. For a moment, we stood there in silence, the air between us charged with unspoken words. And then finally, Kyle reached out, his fingers brushing against mine. Do you think we could start over? He asked, his voice hopeful. I looked up at him, feeling the weight of his question, and after a long pause, I nodded. Yeah, I whispered. I think we can.